Okay, well, welcome everybody, and very warm welcome to Shai Ben-David, who's come as one of our masterclass presenters. Very, very pleased to have Shai here from the University of Waterloo. Just a little bit about Shai's background. He was for a long period at the Technion in Israel, and then had visiting positions at now Australian National University and almost in London, but quite. And then moved to Canada and has been at the University of Waterloo since. So he's done a number of foundational works in machine learning, but also back theoretical side of machine learning, but also in combinatorics and other areas of theoretical computer science as well. So he's got a wide spectrum of interests and a lot of techniques himself that he can use. So it's really a great pleasure to have him here to give these 3 masterclass lectures. Before I hand over, I should also say a big thank you to Google DeepMind, who have sponsored this event. It's very kind of them to do so, particularly in this transition period when they're becoming Google. I'm not saying they're getting less deep, but they have other things on their mind. So on that point, I'll hand over.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay.
Can you just blow the microphone for people to check it works?
I think that just records. Yeah.
That works.
Okay, so I'm going to talk. This talk is going to be about the foundations of clustering, and as the title already says, there are few results and there are many challenges. And one of my goals is to encourage people to look into those questions. It seems that it's an area where there's a lot of practical applications, tons of papers coming out every year, but very, very little theoretical understanding. So all of my 3 talks are going to be about machine learning theory, and I will discuss all the topics we'll discuss are topics that share this kind of description, that they are practically important, but on the other hand, they're not well understood theoretically. So the first one is going to be the clustering, and the second one is going to be about the use of unlabeled data in classification tasks, and that's tomorrow. And on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about what I call reality-relevant computational complexity. I have the claim that worst-case computational complexity is too pessimistic to be realistic, and the question is what alternatives can we come up with. Okay, so let me start with today's talk about clustering, and there is a citation that I'm always tend to start my talks with, and this is a high-level view of science from Herbert Simon, who has, I think, 2 Nobel Prizes, one in economy and another one, I don't remember, but maybe computer science. No, we don't have computer science in there, right? But anyway, he says that the purpose of science is to find meaningful simplicity in the midst of this orderly complexity. And I think it's a very nice phrasing of what is the goal of science, but we can also view it as the goal of clustering. So this is exactly what we're trying to do in clustering. You get a lot of data, you have big data, very complex, very high dimensional, lots of data points, and you're trying to find some meaningful structure in it, and that's basically what we're trying to do in clustering. And as you may probably all know, I mean, clustering is one of the most widely used tools when we try to explore data. It's used all over the place. You do clustering of social networks, and you do clustering of proteins, and you do clustering of galaxies, and a lot of applications of clustering in computer science. But still, it seems that there exists very, very little theoretical understanding of what clustering is. And that's what I'm going to focus on here, trying to show you what can we say, and even more, what is there that we don't know yet. Okay, so why should we care about theory? Because my stress is about theory. I don't know if I need this justification here, but just quick points. First of all, theory gives us performance guarantees. Whenever I see papers that show me here is an algorithm and here is some data sets on which this algorithm works perfectly, I kind of have this question, okay, so it worked very nicely for these data sets that you managed to find for your paper, but will it work on my application? If you have theoretical guarantees, then you know that there is some kind of safety net for any application you're going to use it for. Theory is also important for motivating the development of algorithms, and as we'll see, in clustering, it's very important for selecting the right algorithm for your clustering application. And finally, I think we're doing theory because we would like to understand what is happening, and theory is kind of aiming to give us understanding, or whatever that was. Okay, so we are trying to do theory of clustering, and the first question we can ask is, what is clustering? Can we formally define it? And I think that there are other questions. The other one that I'm going to talk about is the model selection issues. So how would you choose the best clustering algorithms for your data? And how should you set the parameters, like the number of clusters? So this is a question that I'm going to focus about, but I'll start with trying to define what clustering is. And in the talk on Wednesday, I'll talk about computational complexity issues, but that's not for today. Okay, so what is clustering? So the definition you will find in any Wikipedia or whatever you search is that you're trying to partition the data so that similar points reside in the same cluster and non-similar points get separated. The problem with this definition, there are several problems. The first definition is that these two requirements cannot be simultaneously met for many data. I mean, similarity is not a transitive notion, but being in the same cluster is transitive. So you cannot satisfy this at the same time, and we'll see such examples. The other problem is that since we cannot satisfy both of them simultaneously, the definition doesn't tell us how should we handle the conflict between the two parts of the desirable properties of clustering. So as a result, clustering is not well defined. This is not a clear definition. So if I give you this data set and ask you what is the correct clustering of these data sets, so one answer could be like this. If I'm trying to keep close points together, then I cannot create a separation until I reach the gap on the left-hand side. But if I want to avoid far points from being in the same cluster, then I really don't like this long cluster because it contains points that are very far in the same cluster, then maybe the clustering that I would like to have is this one. So my definition of trying to put close points together and trying to separate far points immediately gives rise to ambiguity. What is the correct clustering for this data set? And the same for data sets like this. I mean, if this is your data set, what is a good clustering? Is this a good clustering, or is this a good clustering? I mean, here I'm trying, this clustering makes sure that close points will not be separated, but as a result, you have very far points in the same cluster. This clustering will be the results of if you apply two means, for example, and this will try to make sure that you don't have far points in the same cluster, but then you cut across very similar points. So what is the correct clustering for these data sets? And we can also see lots of practical such qualities. It asks you to cluster paintings. How should you cluster it? What is the correct clustering by the painter or by the subject? If I ask you to cluster speech recordings, do you want to cluster them by the speaker or by the content? If you want to cluster documents, and on and on and on. Anything, any kind of data set you should cluster There is lots of ways by which you could cluster it, and it's not well defined. So this is the first inherent obstacle to doing a theory of clustering. It's not well defined. There's a wide variety of different clustering tasks with different notions of clustering quality. The other big problem when you're trying to do theory of clustering is there's no clear ground truth. So in contrast with what we see with classification, if I want to do classification, I want to classify your emails into spam and not spam, there is ground truth. I can give you my spam filter, and you can check how well it does on your data. But with clustering, we don't have any ground truth. And when you look at what is happening in papers, people, as evidence for the quality of the clustering, they give you usually pictures in 2 dimensions and show you home, oh, my good clustering algorithm found those patches. But if you have data which is in dimension 300, and you have hundreds of thousands of points, there's no way you could eyeball it and tell me whether the clustering is good or not. So how can we do theory when we don't have a notion of ground truth? So there are really many obstacles to developing a theory for clustering. And let me next give you some of the common solutions, just that you'll have a reference of comparing what I'm saying in this talk to things that you might have seen in papers in the literature. So there are many common solutions. Maybe the first one that you will see is people postulate some objective functions. So if you're trying to minimize the in-cluster distances, or the average distances from center points, or the cut weight, and so on. So you postulate some kind of an objective function, which is well defined, which you can calculate, evaluate, and trying to minimize this function. But again, the question is, which objective function should I choose for my application? Another common solution is to consider generative models. So if you assume that your data was generated by a mixture of Gaussians, then things are well defined. You're trying to recover the parameters of those Gaussians. But in reality, if I give you a social networks, or I give you clusters of proteins, nobody guarantees that they were generated by a mixture of Gaussians. Nobody tells me, even if they were, what is the number of such Gaussians, and so on. But that's one way of trying to make our task more concrete and better defined. Another way is to add structure. If we have a notion of relevant information, then we can say, okay, the goal of the clustering is to somehow compress the data, get rid of irrelevant information and retain the relevant information. But of course, we need for that this extra notion of what is the relevant information for my data. Other solutions are an axiomatic approach that I'll talk more about in this talk. You try to postulate some kind of clustering axioms, and ideally, any clustering should satisfy those axioms, and anything that is not a clustering should fail one of those axioms. One of the problems is, so far, it hasn't been very successful. So far, whenever you see a paper about trying to axiomatize clustering, usually it either ends up with the conclusion that the axioms are inconsistent, or it turns out with the even more annoying conclusion that people write a set of axioms and then they prove that the only clustering that satisfies this set of axioms is their algorithm. I mean, it's very nice for writing a paper, but it's not very convincing from a high-level point of view. So the question is, can we come up with some kind of theory that will be independent of any particular algorithm, not just analyze a specific algorithm, independent of any particular objective function, because clustering has many possible objective functions, and independent of any specific generative model. And this is a very difficult challenge. But still, I mean, you compare it to other areas of computer science or mathematics, we do have such understanding. We do have theories that are independent of the algorithm or independent of generative model. But we don't have it for clustering. And if we had such a theory, I mean, here are some questions that I would like to be able to answer. So, can we give a general definition of what clustering is? can we distinguish good clustering from bad clusterings? If you get the answering of the clustering algorithm, can you distinguish it good or bad? Not just if it's pictures in 2 dimensions with very clear clusters. Can we distinguish clusterable data from structureless data? It is very clear intuitively that clusters do not exist in any data. If the data is uniformly spread out, maybe there are no real clusters. But can we tell whether the clusters that we found are meaningful or they're just an artifact of our algorithm or noise? Can we distinguish meaningful from random structure? And the one that I'll talk about most now is that given a clustering task, how should the user choose a suitable clustering algorithm for this particular task? Which is a very important question in practice. Okay, so let me get a little bit more technical. Because there are lots of ways one could define even the framework for clustering, so let me try to be concrete. So the basic setting that I'll talk about is that you have some domain set S, and you have some notion of dissimilarity function. D is a function that takes pairs of points of S and gives you a score of how dissimilar these points are, and we assume that the distance between 2 points is 0 if and only if it's the same point, and we assume symmetry, but we don't assume the triangle inequality, therefore I call it dissimilarity rather than a metric. And so the input is such a dissimilarity function over some domain, and the output should be a partition of the domain. That's the framework that I want to work with. So we assume that someone gave us already the relevant dissimilarity, and we focus on what should be the good clustering, given that dissimilarity. Of course, there is also a lot of research on what is the right similarity to work with, but I will just focus on the model, the simpler model where it's given to us. Okay, so we wish to define some properties. So what I'll do in this stage of the talk, I'll try to define some properties that distinguish clustering functions from other functions that output the domain partition. So there could be many functions that take as input some set with distances over its elements and output a partition. So how should we distinguish clustering functions from any arbitrary functions? So in 2002, John Kleinberg came up with these 3 axioms that should be satisfied by clustering functions. The first is scale invariance, which means that so f is my clustering function. F takes the dissimilarity as input and outputs a partition. So if I take all my dissimilarities and multiply them by a constant, then f of lambda d should be the same as f of d. Which just means that if I change the scale, then the clustering that I output should stay the same. And then the second axiom is richness, and richness says that in some sense you don't want the clustering function to be a function that always outputs the same partition. So you want to say that for every partition of your set, there exists some distance, such that with this distance, the outcome of your function will be this partition. So if I want to output a clustering that separates this group of people this way, I'll just input the distances as you're sitting now. If I want to have a clustering that will separate John from the rest of everybody, then I'll have a distance that will take him and put him here in the corner, and everybody in the other corner, I'll get that partition. So every possible partition could be obtained by playing with the distances. It's not a constant, far from being a constant function. But note that these 2 requirements, they say nothing about close points being together and far points being apart. And this was a major property of clustering, so we somehow have to relate to this, and this comes through this requirement of consistency. So if we take our original distance d and replace it by d prime, and d prime is such that it shrank distances within clusters of f of d and stretch distances between clusters. So I gave you some distance, you gave me your clustering. So say I gave you the distances of people in this room, and you gave me this clustering. Now I tell all the people in one cluster to get closer together, all the people in the other cluster get closer together, and I separate even further the two clusters. And I'll feed the new distance back to my clustering function. I want it in such a case the clustering function will output the same partition. It will just be more confident about the partition because inside clusters shrank and outside clusters grew. So this looks like relatively sensible axioms. Yes?
So with a mixture of Gaussian's algorithm doesn't fully satisfy this, because when you're more confident about your clusters, your soft assignments become harder. So that's kind of, it's a weak breaking of this.
Right. I mean, there are algorithms that don't satisfy it. The result is even stronger. The result is that no algorithm can satisfy it. So the secret is that I think when John Kleiber put this axiom, he was aiming towards an impossibility result, because there is this famous impossibility result for social choice. How is it called? For voting, there's no perfect voting scheme. Arrow's theorem. And Arrow got Nobel Prize. So John Kleiber was trying to get an impossibility result, and he designed the axiom to get impossibility. But anyway, it's not a coincidence that a mixture of Gaussian clustering doesn't satisfy it. Nothing could satisfy it. And here is a very simple proof of this. So I want to prove to you that no function can satisfy those three requirements simultaneously. So take some data set. By richness, I know that there is some way to put the points such that the clustering will be every point lives in its own cluster. Because richness told me you can separate the points to obtain any possible partition. And I know that I can get also a setting of the points in which I get a different partitioning, which is not the trivial partitioning. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the distances here and grow them such that the minimal distance in the result will be bigger than the smaller distance here. So I'm just spreading it away. I'm taking the set and I'm scaling up. I'm scaling up by so much that the minimal distance here will be bigger than the maximum distance here. So what is happening now? I just took this data set and scaled it up a lot. By the scale invariance, the partition of this set should be the same as the partition here. But if I compare this set to this set, since every distance here is bigger than the distances here, by consistency, what I did is I just took points in different clusters and drew them further apart. So if I took points in different clusters and drew them further apart, the partition here should be the same as the partition here. So the partition of this set should be the same as this, and should be the same as this. Therefore, there is a contradiction. So we just proved that those three axioms are not consistent. So what is the meaning of this result? I think that a popular interpretation of this result is it is impossible to axiomatize clustering, but of course this is not what we showed. What we actually showed was just that these particular three axioms, phrased in terms of clustering functions, do not work. But it shouldn't be the end of attempts to axiomatize clustering. So ideally, we would like to have a theory that will have axioms such that any clustering method satisfies all the axioms, and any functions which is clearly not a clustering fails to satisfy one of the axioms. Probably it's too much to require because we are in a circular situation here. I mean, we try to define what is clustering, and our definition should depend on what is clustering and what is not. So it's not a very clear task, but ideally we should go in that direction. And on top of it, we should have a list of what I call properties. And properties are properties of clustering functions that are not common to all the clustering functions, but they allow us to distinguish different families of clustering functions. They allow us to have some order, some understanding of the space of clustering functions. And so what should we require from a set of clustering axioms, how can we define completeness of such axioms, and even more importantly, if you come up with clustering axioms, are there any non-trivial properties that the axiom could prove? If I have axioms of group theory, so first of all, it's clear that all the groups satisfy the axioms of group theory. But the main advantage of having axioms of group theory is that I could prove some properties of groups just based on the axioms. And it will hold for any group, no matter if it's symmetric group, or it's the rationals, or whatever, right? So are there any such properties of clustering that I could prove from a general theory, from an axiomatic point of view, and then it would be an interesting property to show that it really applies to different clustering functions. So we are very far. This is just showing the way to interesting questions that we don't have answers to. So what is my take from this? Since we do not have general axioms, we really need to incorporate some domain-specific bias. So to turn clustering into a well-defined task, one needs to add some bias that expresses prior knowledge about your task, or about the domain. And the next part of my talk, I will focus on several frameworks for formalizing such domain knowledge. So we give up at this point on trying to find a general theory of clustering and try to find ways to express domain knowledge that will be relevant to finding out which clustering are appropriate for your data. Okay, so that's the second part of the talk. Given a clustering task, how should we define a suitable clustering paradigm? Let me start by showing you an impossibility result, which is even simpler than Kleinberg's one. So for every two values, alpha and beta, I claim that there exists no clustering function that is guaranteed to cluster together every pair of points which are closer than alpha, and guaranteed to separate every pair of points which the distance is larger than beta, for every choice of alpha and beta. So it doesn't matter how small alpha is and how big beta is, you will not be able to at the same time guarantee that every so close points are together and every so far points are apart. Does anybody see the proof? It's a one-line proof in more than one meaning. Here is the one line. So assume that these are my points, and this is the distance alpha, and this is the distance beta. So if I want to make sure that every points which are closer than alpha together are in the same cluster, I will have to put all the points in the same cluster, but then I'll get points of distance beta which are in the same cluster. And it doesn't matter what are the values of alpha and beta. So this is a very simple impossibility. The two requirements that we need in the definition, that we have in the definition of clustering, are contradictory right from the onset. And one can find such contradictions with other desirable properties of clustering. So another kind of desirable property of clustering is kind of balancing the number of points in different clusters. So sometimes it's desirable that you will not have very big clusters compared to tiny clusters. But again, it's very easy to see that there is no algorithm at the same time will cluster together close points and retain some balance between the cluster sizes. So here is another requirement of clustering, some balance between cluster sizes, no matter how we phrase it, no matter how we put an upper bound of the biggest cluster and lower bound of the smallest cluster, it will always contradict the requirement to have close points together. And I leave the proof to you. It's very obvious how to do it. And similarly, you cannot satisfy balance at the same time as making sure that you separate every very dissimilar points. So the requirements of clustering are kind of contradictory in their nature, and it's not just a theoretical issue. So here I wanted to give some examples in which you're really the emphasis in clustering should be different. So one application of clustering is the duplication of records in a database. Say I have a database of citations. I mean, I don't know which citation the index you're using, but I'm using DBLP, and I'm very happy to go to DBLP and realize that I have so many papers. But if I check it more carefully, some of those papers are repetitions. And in database theory, it's a big challenge. You get a record of patients from different hospitals. How do you do deduplication? How do you detect when different records refer to the same patient? So one way they're doing it is by clustering. Now note that such a clustering should have an emphasis on separating dissimilar points. I mean, you don't want to claim the two records that look very, very different are the same patients. And that's more important to you than making sure that every close records are the same, are clustered together. So in such an application, you want to emphasize making sure that far points are not clustered together. On the other hand, if I want to cluster, say, people for predicting viral spread of rumors or viral spread of a disease, then it is very important to me that to put in the same cluster every two people that are close together. If they're close together, then the rumor will certainly pass from this person to that person. And I don't care about separating very far points. Maybe the rumor passes very quickly through all this group of people and doesn't reach this group of people, and it doesn't matter that she is very far from me. And so such an application will require a completely different emphasis of clustering, and here is an application that requires balance. So say I want to cluster neighborhoods for coverage by fire stations, which is another useful use of clustering. I want to cluster, I don't know, neighborhoods for maybe fire stations are old-fashioned, but coverage by Wi-Fi routers or something. Then it is very important to me to have balance between the different clusters. I don't want to have many, many very small clusters, or one big cluster that will be too big for me to serve. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that each of those contradictory requirements, in some applications, you really care about this one and less about the other ones. And in general, one can depict this situation by a picture like this. So you have some kind of, you can think of it as a simplex. And when the nodes of the simplex are different requirements from clustering. And every specific clustering algorithm should be a point in this simplex, according to how much attention it pays to each of the different requirements. And there are more than just 3 requirements. There can be many, many more requirements like this. And we should think of a clustering algorithm as picking some point in this simplex of balancing between the different requirements. Okay, so before I get more specific, let me just mention a few. I don't know how familiar you are with clustering algorithms. Just to show you there are many clustering algorithms, and then we will go into trying to classify such algorithms according to their behaviors. So basically, if we want to look at family of clustering algorithms, one distinction is between those that are algorithmically defined, like agglomerative clustering. So agglomerative clustering are clusterings linkage-based that start with every point being separate, and in stages each time you merge more and more and more. Note that these kind of algorithms are defined algorithmically. I didn't define any specific objective. I just told you this is the way I'm going to do the clustering. And the clustering is defined algorithmically. And another way is model-based, like EM or K-means algorithm, that are defined algorithmically. Spectral clustering is another example of a very famous, very popular clustering algorithm that defined algorithmically. Here is the algorithm that I'm going to use. I'm going to take the matrix of distances, find the principal eigenvalues, and project to these eigenvectors. So I'm describing my algorithm rather than describing my goal. That's one family of algorithms. Here is just an example of single linkage. Merges close point together. If you choose badly your cutting point, you get in too many clusters. If you choose them correctly, you get the right clusters. If you choose the cutting point too late, everything will merge into one cluster. Anyway, we'll talk about this maybe later if we have time, about how to choose the right parameters for your algorithm. Another family of clustering algorithms are those based on objective functions. So those are cost-driven. You define what is the cost that you try to minimize, and now the clustering aims to minimize this cost, and it's defined by the cost, and then you can choose different algorithms to try to achieve the optimization of this task. So here are center-based objectives like k-means, k-median, minimize the sum of distances, minimize the max cut objective, minimize the ratio between within cluster variance and between cluster variance. Lots of clustering defined by objective function. And okay, so I will not, these are center-based clustering, and just to show that there are many, many different ways. These are center-based clustering where you want to choose a center for every cluster, and you want the center to be as representative of the cluster as possible. Okay, so then we have lots of different tools for algorithms, and the question is, how do we find guidelines for choosing an algorithm? So in practice, how is it being done in practice? Have any of you ever used the clustering algorithm for some practical application? Yes. Okay, you are one of the smart guys, right? But what I usually see is that it's really being done in a very ad hoc manner. I mean, if I ask people in databases, why do you use this clustering algorithm rather than another one, or someone in bioinformatics, usually the answer will be, because my friend used it and it worked for him for his problem, right? And I mean, to me, the example that I have here is different than the example that I have in mind. I mean, the example that I have here, which is that last month I was in China, and if you are sick in Beijing and you go to a pharmacy and you want to choose some medicine to buy and you don't speak Chinese, then the way people currently choose clustering algorithms is if you go to the pharmacy and choose your medicine by the colors of the package and maybe also by the price. And that's it. I mean, my example for so people choose based on easiness of use, freely downloadable software, or it works for my friends, it runs fast, etc. And it has nothing to do with how the algorithm works. I mean, my real example is my parents, which are very old, and my mother had a stomach disorder, and she got some advice that she should drink a lot of Coca-Cola. It's supposed to believe to help your stomach disorder. And then my father had a flu, and we came to visit him, and he was drinking a lot of Coca-Cola because he had my mother. This is the way people do clustering, and these are scientists. So the challenge is to find some guidelines for choosing the right clustering paradigm, formulate some properties that will allow us to translate prior knowledge about the domain into some choice of clustering functions. So the ideal theory should look like this. This is just a ideal picture. So you'll have some kind of, you have here a list of different clustering methods, and here you have some requirements, which are axioms, that every clustering method should satisfy all of them. And then you have requirements like consistency or richness or whatever, which are just specific to some, hold for some clustering algorithms, but not hold for others. And ideally, what you will do is you'll look at this table and see which of those requirements are important for my application, and then you will go and search for an algorithm that satisfies all the requirements that are relevant to your application. But as we saw, no clustering algorithm can satisfy all the requirements. So next I'll introduce some high-level properties that allow us to distinguish families of clustering functions. And these are just, it is just the first step in a big project. So the first one is order consistency. So what is order consistency? I say that two distances are, that they are order compatible if whenever D claims that ST are closer than UV, then D prime agrees that ST is closer than UV. So all that is similar between them is how they order the different pairs, but not the values. But sometimes this is the relevant information that we have. Sometimes we really cannot trust the values of the distances, but maybe we can trust the order of the distances. So we say that the clustering algorithm is order consistent if whenever you have such D and D prime that agree on the ordering between pairs, then the outcome clustering will be the same. So this is a property of clustering function, that it is invariant to changing the distance in a way that preserves the distances. Another property is the notion of, based on the notion of path distance. So what is a path distance? The path distance between 2 points is the minimum over all passes that connect these points of the largest jump along the path. So think of it as, I wanted to define the path distance from this point to this point. So here is one pass, here is a second pass, here is a third pass. So I go over all these passes and minimize the largest jump over the pass. So here the largest jump is 4, here it's 7, here it's 2. So the path distance between these 2 points is 2. It's like you want to cross a river and you have all kinds of stones and wood on the river, and you're trying to find a path in which that will minimize the largest jump that you have to make. And that's the distance between 2 banks of the river. That's the path distance. And now I can say that a clustering function is path distance coherent if whenever I give it 2 distance functions that induce the same path distance, then I will get the same clustering. Now this is also sometimes relevant information. If I'm looking at, say, sequences of genes in a chromosome and I'm trying to find which species are related, so you have the notion of an edit distance, and maybe there were many mutations that led you from this gene to this chromosome to this chromosome. But the likelihood of having made this path depends also on the biggest jump along this path. So another requirement is such a property of clustering. And now it turns out that if you want to have K richness, that is, you fix K and you want to get all possible clustering into K, and you want to have order consistency, you're only dependent on the ordering, but not upon the values of distances, and to have path distance coherent, then the only function, the only clustering function that satisfies those 3 properties is single linkage. The simplest clustering algorithm just sequentially merges the 2 closest clusters. So this is some kind of the type of results that I would like to get. You get some general properties of clustering functions, and I can tell the user if these properties are important to you, then this is the clustering algorithm that you should use. Another result along the same lines is relates to linkage-based.
Sorry, is that a theorem about existing functions or
No,
any conceivable?
Any conceivable function. Any conceivable function that satisfies those 3 requirements is single linkage, is equivalent to single linkage. No, I mean, it's not interesting to talk about existing. I'm talking, it's a mathematical theorem. Any function that satisfies those 3 properties does exactly the same outcome as single linkage. Okay? And now I want to look at the wider family of all linkage-based clustering paradigms. So linkage-based clustering paradigms, they're like single linkage or every linkage or complete linkage. So how do I define them? All of this family. So we're given some distance, and then given the distance d, we have a notion of induced distance over subsets. So the algorithm first takes every point as a single cluster, and then in the n+1 stage, it takes the clusters that you have in the nth stage and merge the 2 closest clusters. So note that such an algorithm depends on this d hat. How do I define distance between 2 clusters? So single linkage defines the distance between 2 clusters as the distance between the closest points. Average linkage defines the distance as the average distance between the max linkage, defines the distance between 2 clusters as the distance between the furthest points. So in general, you can pick very many such extensions of the distance to distance between sets and come up with a linkage-based algorithm. So we have some requirements for such linkage functions, which I will not elaborate on. And then we want to characterize all the linkage-based functions. It tells that they have a nice characterization. So one property is refinement property. If you want to cluster to more classes than before, then the clustering that you will get is a refinement of the old clustering. If I want to cluster to 3 clusters rather than 2, then such a clustering will split one of the 2 clusters, but will not create a new cluster out of pieces from one and pieces from the other. So that's refinement consistency. The next property is locality. So locality is an interesting property. It's a property that says, assume that I gave you, so I applied my clustering function to some domain distances with some number of clusters. And now I took a subset of clusters. So S now is a collection of clusters. And now I'm trying to cluster just this set of clusters with the same distance function and the same number of clusters that I have. I want to get the same S. So it just means that, you see, if I get lots of clusters, I pick a subset of the clusters and I say, okay, now this is my domain. How will my function cluster it? It will cluster it in the same way regardless of what is happening in the other clusters. That's why I call it locality. So locality could be an interesting or relevant problem in some applications. That clustering some area of your domain is not affected by how you cluster other areas. But it turns out that it does dissect the family of clustering algorithms into different clustering. Some satisfy it, some don't. So we also have a notion of richness, and then we get a theorem that says that clustering functions can be defined as linkage-based clustering if and only if it satisfies those 3 properties. So it turns out that all linkage-based clustering, no matter how you do the linkage, satisfy the refinement, extended richness, and the locality property that we just talked about, and no other function satisfies it. So every clustering function that doesn't satisfy those 3 properties cannot be obtained through a linkage-based procedure. So a corollary, for example, is that k-means cannot be obtained by any linkage-based procedure, which is kind of discouraging because we know that k-means is a very difficult objective to optimize. Linkage-based algorithms are very easy to run, but it tells you you will not be able to get the k-means partition from a linkage-based agglomerative process. And similarly for spectral clustering. It turns out that spectral clustering fails locality, and therefore by this theorem we know that we could not get the outcome of spectral clustering by just agglomeratively merging, using some rule of merging of small clusters. So here is this characterization of another family of clustering functions. Okay, so to summarize, I mean, I have here come up with characterizations by high-level input-output properties of several popular clustering paradigms, for example, single linkage or general linkage, linkage-based clusters, and there's much more work to be done. So I think other parameters that vary, I mean, there are other parameters you may want to consider that vary between clustering methods. Is the drive towards point balance between the clusters. To what extent your algorithm emphasizes that all the clusters will have the similar number of points. And another property is sensitivity to point weights. Maybe, I mean, if you add points at the same location, will it change the clustering or not? Another property could be perturbation, robustness to noise, to perturbation noise, or robustness to outliers. So different clustering algorithms can differ by their sensitivity to perturbations of the data points. And it will affect your choice of algorithm because if you assume that the measurements of your points was imprecise, then you want an algorithm that is robust to small perturbations. But if you can trust your measurements very well, you may want an algorithm that is sensitive to perturbations because you know that every bit there is meaningful. And the same about sensitivity to outliers. So what I'm saying here is that there are lots of other dimensions along which we can try to classify clustering algorithms. And I want to start to go towards the conclusion of this talk by giving some warnings to common things that you see in clustering papers. So the first warning is against visual demonstrations. So visual demonstrations, are very common in clustering papers, but of course, if you do visual demonstration, it's inevitably about low dimension. So if you have problems already in low dimension, then it may be a good demonstration, because I can show you this algorithm fails already in dimension 2. So it's very likely to have problems with dimension 100. But for niceness of an algorithm, demonstrating that your algorithm works nicely on two-dimensional data is no guarantee that it will work nicely on high-dimensional data. So visual demonstrations are very common as a supporting evidence to an algorithm, and I claim that they are almost meaningless. So visual demonstration carry very low significance as an evidence of the success of a clustering method. I'm giving you directions of how to review clustering papers or how to detect that I was your reviewer. Another warning is one of the things that I see is that, this is something really, this is the last issue of Science. And there is an article, I don't know if any of you have seen the last issue of Science. There's an article about clustering, and they advocate the clustering algorithm like this. Our clustering procedure is such that the number of clusters arises intuitively. That is, it's autonomously determined by the algorithm. You don't have to set it. And outliers are automatically spotted and excluded for the analysis. So this sounds very attractive. You don't have to worry. The algorithm will make all the important decisions for you. And it looks like a very attractive notion. So these are, this paper is not alone. It's often a selling point of the clustering software to say, you don't need to worry, we will make the key decisions for you. We will, this algorithm is wonderful, it chooses the parameters for you. Since we know that we have no known good way of what those choices are, I think it is similar that I'll advocate a smart web application that you will give it your budget, and this web application will automatically spot the best online deals and purchase them for you. So how happy you will be? You don't have to worry about what to buy. My algorithm will search the internet, find the best deals for you. But of course, what if you there's an amazing bargain about golf sets and you don't care about golf? Or an amazing bargain about collector stamps, I don't know. You will never be tempted by an application that does shopping for you, finds the best deals. But people are tempted by a clustering algorithm that does all the choices for you and find the best clusters for you. And I think it is not, in principle, it is not very different. And my last warning, or not, is the focus on computational complexity issues. So most of the common cost minimizing clusterings are NP hard to optimize, and therefore many clustering papers propose algorithms whose main merit is efficiency of computation. And that also should be taken with a grain of salt. Because when I tell you that my computation is efficient, you should watch out. There's not much point in efficiency without considering what did I compute. What did I optimize? And you'll see that people come out, here is an algorithm that can be done efficiently. But of course, there is an algorithm that can be done efficiently. The algorithm that always gives you a constant result. So, but those things that, I didn't come up with this. This is tons of papers that you are now reviewing for NIPS for tonight, if you're reviewing any clustering paper. So, to summarize, there are some very heavy open challenges characterize many of the common clustering paradigms in terms of the input-output behavior. Most importantly, come up with properties that reflect considerations that users really have. I mean, I think the most significant criticism that I feel about my work is that I'm always negative. I mean, it's not only about my work, but everything. But here, it's really a question. Yes, clustering is not well defined. Yes, you need prior knowledge to define what is the good clustering for your application, but we should find a language by which a user or application domain expert will be able to communicate to us the requirements of their domain. And we don't have such a language. I mean, I cannot tell the user, you know, do you care about locality of the clustering, or about, you know, like in SVMs, is your notion of similarity positive, semi-definite, or something like that. So, particularly in clustering and more generally in machine learning, we need to come up with a language to communicate between the users and the algorithms experts, and that's a big challenge here. So in summary, clustering has lots of open challenges. They're all practically important. Lots of it is not done yet, and I think that they're theoretically approachable. And here I address two of them, defining clustering and coming up with guidance for algorithm selection. And then next time I'll talk about the computational complexity. So, yeah, I think I'll stop here.
So I think we've got time for a few quick questions.
What's your take on exchangeability of the data? I mean, if the data is exchangeable, then what kind of clustering algorithm should be good for?
What do you mean exchangeability?
Exchangeability in the sense, like, if I have an algorithm where, like, the data can be, I mean, if it's a batch algorithm and then the data can be reordered, it doesn't change the ordering or change the clusters.
Yeah, so one of the basic axioms, it's missed by the Kleinberg axioms, but it should be an axiom, is that the clustering is indifferent to isomorphism of the data.
But if you want an algorithm to respect the exchangeability, then I don't want the data to be exchangeable.
Exchangeable, you just means renaming the points?
No, I mean rearranging the I mean, it's like if I have objects like A, B, C, and D, it gives me some cluster, and if I have like B, C, A, and D,
Right, so this is an isomorphism of your data. So most of the clustering algorithms will not change if you feed them isomorphic data sets. I mean, it's kind of almost obvious requirements that most of the clustering algorithms satisfy.
Yeah, my question is like, which are the ones which change?
Which violate it?
Yeah, which one?
I think the only ones that violate it are online clustering algorithms. The clustering algorithms that takes points one by one and decide on the clustering online. But in clustering, online algorithms are not very common. In classification prediction, they are, but in clustering, not so much. So I think the danger there is not so big. I mean, most of the algorithms will respect it. Yes?
Hi. It's about the idea, the Kleinberg axiom, I guess. It seems to me that the consistency axiom is actually possibly too strong. And I wonder whether you thought, is there a weaker axiom that might be...
Yeah, there are many weaker versions that... First of all, if we fix K, the number of clusters, then even with this consistency, it becomes consistent. And secondly, we can replace the consistency requirement by something like that all the distances inside clusters shrink by the same factor.
Together, the groups
shrink together, right. And all the distances between clusters extend by the same factor, and then again, it gives rise to a consistent set of axioms. But still, each of those sets of axioms, although consistent, there are algorithms that will not satisfy it.
Okay, thank you.
All your examples so far use distances that are between 0 and infinity, so they are sort of unbounded. Could you comment on clustering algorithms that use a bounded distance, or say a probability, like the probability that these two items should be in the same cluster, or the probability they should be distant?
Yeah, these are two different questions. I mean, the issue of bounding is not so crucial. you can usually take some, order-preserving functions from the real line to the unit interval and get similar results. But the issue of probability is crucial, because when I give you a number of similarity number between 2 points, the interpretation of the probability of being in the same cluster and distance, I don't want to get technically into it, but they're not the same. They're not the same, and it's not clear what are the requirements, even from a set. If I interpret my distance as a probability of being in the same cluster, then I have to impose more requirements on my set of, on this function. And it's not completely, it is a complex question. I mean, it's a natural interpretation of the distances, but as input, it makes things much more difficult.
Yeah, so I felt that your definition, the definition of probability where similar points get put in the same cluster and dissimilar ones get put in a different cluster, so it maps quite nicely to a probabilistic interpretation.
In a very intuitive level. But when you get to the technical level, you run into difficulties there.
So, if this stuff becomes then easier to, or harder maybe to axiomatize, if you focus on soft clustering rather than trying to work with algorithms that produce hard clustering?
No, so we tried various, we were looking at various variations of the definition of clustering. Soft clustering, probabilistic clusterings, clusterings in which you have also a set of garbage. You know, if I want to cluster images, then it's very natural that in an image I will have clusters, but also have background, which should not be a cluster. And all of those variations, they seem axiomatically to handle just as difficult. It doesn't make life much easier. They're very interesting to address, and there hasn't been much work there, but it doesn't seem like much easier work. Yes?
I wonder whether, one thing I'd be interested in is, do you believe that there is a single action even that should hold for all clustering methods? Because you kind of say, well, the clustering problem is not really well defined, and I want to have something that is kind of independent of the objective function and generative models and stuff. But you could also say the problem is actually that people are used to using the word cluster analysis for all of these, but actually these are genuinely different problems. So do you kind of want to keep the unity of the field?
So I think that the reason to keep the unity of the field is that this is the way people use it. I mean, we could decide that between you and me, we don't call it clustering and it's different things. But then when I have my database faculty friend that tells me, I want to do clustering for deduplication, and I have another one that tells me, I'm doing mobile networks and I want to do clustering of users. They all use the same word, they all go to the same literature to find solutions, and we have to somehow address the fact that maybe we should be there and say, okay, you all say clustering, now you came to the clustering hub, now we will ask you more concrete questions. But we cannot define away the common perception that clustering is one entity.
But do you think there's a single action that really should hold for all?
I don't think that the axiomatic, finding axiom that holds for all clustering, I don't think that this is a very important part. The more important part is to find relevant properties that can guide you in selection of a good clustering. Yes?
If you cite these properties of what my clustering algorithm have, is there any way of determining the existence of such an algorithm ex ante? I mean, you say you have to go from a needs-based decision process. How do you know that there will be an algorithm that does?
Right, but in some cases you can even, if you have clarified your requirements, you can come up with a clustering algorithm that will do it. It's not difficult to write an objective function that captures what you're trying to achieve, even if, sure, you'll still have the algorithmic function issue. Nobody has written the software for it. But if you have clarified your requirements, often if there's no ready-made clustering algorithm that satisfies those, you can translate those requirements into an objective function and try to optimize that objective function. And I think that's part of the way that some new algorithms are being generated. People realize that they need certain requirements, and they write down an objective function that reflects these requirements. Yes?
Oh, can you define the conditions under which they definitely don't want to do clustering? You mentioned that when data is generated uniformly over the plane, for example, you don't want to do clustering, yeah? I can believe there are other conditions under which you also don't want to do clustering, and you would like to tell the user, really don't bother because anything you get is meaningless.
That's a very good question. I haven't thought about it this way. I mean, I thought about the mirror image of this, of saying, how do you define when your data is clusterable? And several definitions of, we have a paper about notions of clusterability. But it's a good question, trying to separate away things when don't touch this. Yeah, I haven't thought about it.
Oh, my question is it.
Oh, so, okay. I have one more if there's time. Very often, in my experience, I've used clustering in order to discover a set of sort of given classes. And I wonder whether you've got something to say about how you would do that, seeing as you seem to be against algorithms which choose the parameters for you. One of your parameters is the number of classes,
right.
And that's a core use of clustering.
Right. I think that one has to be more careful about understanding how your algorithm chooses the number of clusters for you, and is it an appropriate tool for you. I mean, I have an extension of the talk that I didn't have time to go into. One of the common ways of choosing a number of clusters for you is by a stability method. You say that number of clusters is correct if when you take different samples and you cluster them with this number of clusters, you get the same, similar cluster. And we analyzed this method and we showed that it should not work. That's a good question, why, when in theory it should not work, it works in practice. But I think my general answer is that the bad thing is that when the algorithm does things for you and you're not aware of how it does it. If you are aware and understand it and you agree with the way it handles it, then sure, it's good that the algorithm does it.
Thank you.
Can you say that the notion of whether a particular algorithm produces good or bad clustering doesn't really exist in the abstract, it only exists in the application? So your examples of medical records, someone who works for the NHS wouldn't really consider the different axioms or properties. They would be more interested in something like, does it reduce the amount of time searching for a medical record, or does it reduce the cost of data entry?
Right, but the question is, sure. So what you're saying is that when I do clustering, I have some
sort of real life goal that you're trying
and the question is, right. But what I'm trying to say is, okay, so here is your goal, reduce the time for search or something. But can I translate it into a requirement that will tell you which clustering algorithm will do a good job for you? Because the current state is just you try one, you try another, for each of them you try your search time, and you don't know how the examples that you use for testing it are representative of the whole data. And the hope is that if you understand better the requirements of your application, you will be able to zoom down on a more relevant set of
an intermediate. Yeah.
Okay, no more questions. Okay, let's thank Shai. So there's lunch, I think, in the